Welcome to Africa Geotrends, your window into Africa's power, progress, and geopolitics. Asterisk before we dive in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the stories shaping Africa's future. Africa just shocked the world, and this time, it wasn't with raw resources, conflict headlines, or foreign aid dependency. It was with power, leverage, strategy, and hard numbers. At a moment when global economies are shaking, when Europe's energy security is fragile, when China's Belt and Road strategy is being reassessed, and when the United States is trying to rebuild global credibility, Africa stepped into the center of the world stage and forced everyone to look. Not because of charity, not because of crisis, but because of negotiation power. The world came prepared to support Africa, as usual, but Africa came prepared to define the terms of global development itself. Infrastructure is no longer just roads and bridges here. It is leverage. It is energy corridors. It is data highways. It is trade arteries. It is control of strategic transit. The commitments announced, reinforced, and expanded around the UN platform represent one of the biggest shifts in Africa's global position in decades. Not handouts, structured investment, long-term corridors, power grids, rail expansions, digital backbones, deep sea ports, intercontinental energy pipelines. This isn't a donation cycle. This is repositioning. The continent is no longer selling poverty. It is selling scale, access, demographics, resources, and stability corridors. The numbers behind this shift are enormous. Multi-billion-dollar packages tied to power generation, solar grids, green hydrogen, inter-African trade highways, mineral logistics, fiber optics, and regional integration. Not just from Western partners, but from a mix of Gulf capital, Asian infrastructure funds, development institutions, climate financing frameworks, and sovereign partnerships. This is the moment many thought would never happen. For decades, Africa was seen as a frontier, a risk, a charity project, or a future market. Now it is being treated as core infrastructure territory in the 21st century global order. What changed is not only politics, but strategy. African governments entered global negotiations coordinated. Instead of fragmented voices, blocs spoke. Regional alliances presented unified frameworks. Infrastructure wasn't sold as aid, but as mutual economic survival. Power corridors connecting West to North Africa and into Europe make Africa part of Europe's energy solution. Mineral transport grids make Africa central to the global electric vehicle transition. Data and digital backbone investments place African tech ecosystems inside global network routes. The result is this. The world did not give Africa anything. The world committed because it had to. Because Africa controls critical minerals for the energy transition. Because Africa is the youngest workforce on the planet. Because Africa is the fastest urbanizing region on Earth. Because Africa's power gap is now a global risk, not just a continental one. Because the next global supply chain vulnerability or stability will depend on what happens on this continent. This is why these infrastructure pledges are not symbolic. They are strategic. They are defensive. They are future-proofing moves by global powers reacting to Africa's rising leverage. And what makes this moment even bigger is that for the first time, Africa is not just receiving, but negotiating. Pushing for local value addition. Demanding technology transfer. Insisting on African ownership in projects. Protecting sovereign stakes in critical assets. This is not the Africa of structural adjustment or dependency cycles. This is Africa running a geopolitical playbook. And it is happening right now. What the international community is responding to is not sympathy, it is necessity. Africa holds over 30% of the world's critical minerals. Congo dominates cobalt. Guinea commands bauxite. Namibia and South Africa sit on essential rare earths. Lithium projects are expanding across Zimbabwe, Namibia, DRC, and Mali. At the same time, Africa's energy potential, solar, wind, hydro, and green hydrogen, has become a cornerstone of the global climate transition. Europe cannot meet its carbon neutrality targets without African energy partnerships. Asia cannot secure long-term mineral supply without African corridors. The United States cannot counterbalance Chinese infrastructure diplomacy without investing in African networks. That is the underlying engine behind these new infrastructure commitments. And it explains why they go beyond development aid. They are long-term positioning plays. The most prominent proposals linked to UN-centered discussions include transcontinental energy corridors designed to export African renewable power northward, new multi-country transport rails linking resource regions to ports, upgraded port expansions along Eastern and Western Africa for global shipping, and digital backbone projects that connect African innovation centers to the rest of the world with low-latency fiber infrastructure. These are not scattered deals. They are connected. They are about integrating Africa into the bloodstream of global supply and energy networks. For decades, Africa was on the margins of the global system. Now it is being physically plugged into its central circuitry. Another major factor driving this shift is Africa's growing internal market. The African Continental Free Trade Area, already operational, has created the potential for the largest free trade zone in the world by number of countries. Infrastructure investment is now being justified not only as external extraction routes, but as internal trade corridors. Roads connecting Lagos to Abidjan are becoming as important as export routes to Europe. Rail lines connecting landlocked nations to regional ports are being reconstructed not just for mining exports, but for manufacturing supply chains. Energy interconnection projects linking power pools across West, East, and Southern Africa are reducing historic fragmentation. This kind of integrated vision is what has made global investors start seeing Africa not as 54 separate risks, but as one massive emerging economic organism. That reframing is a huge shift. It is one of the main reasons these infrastructure pledges have scaled so aggressively. Financially, what makes these commitments different from old ones is their structure. They are increasingly blended finance models, combining public development funds with private capital, climate financing, and risk-sharing mechanisms. This reduces the cost of borrowing for African states while increasing long-term investor participation. Projects are being tied to performance metrics, power outputs, trade volumes, and digital penetration instead of just construction completion. There is also a visible push for local job creation, skills transfer, and regional ownership. In many of these infrastructure frameworks, African governments and institutions are not just hosts. They are stakeholders, holding equity, sitting at decision tables, sometimes even leading project implementation. That has never been the global norm, but it is becoming more common. And that is where the power shift lies. One of the most discussed elements in global policy circles is Africa's emerging role as a clean energy partner. With vast solar potential in the Sahel, wind along coastal corridors, hydro in central regions, and green hydrogen capacity in North Africa, the continent is positioned not just as a consumer, but as an exporter of clean energy to energy-hungry regions. Infrastructure pledges around energy corridors are not symbolic environmental gestures. They are linked to hard security concerns. Europe's energy crisis after geopolitical disruptions revealed a dangerous dependency. African renewable infrastructure is now seen as part of the diversification solution. Power cables, hydrogen pipelines, export terminals, and cross-border grid connections are being planned and negotiated as part of that reality. This gives African states leverage, because energy security is not a soft issue. It is a national survival issue for many global powers. Transport is another strategic layer. The rehabilitation and expansion of key transport routes across Africa is not only about mobility. It is about trade speed, logistics cost, and global competitiveness. The faster minerals, agricultural goods, and manufactured products move across borders, the more competitive African economies become. At the same time, it makes global supply chains more resilient by diversifying routes and mitigating single-region dependency. Several infrastructure frameworks now explicitly reference Africa as a solution to global supply chain risks. That language itself marks a shift in perception. Africa is no longer being discussed as a risk zone. It is being framed as a risk reducer. Digital infrastructure is also at the center of this transformation. Massive investments in submarine cables, data centers, cloud hubs, and continental fiber networks are positioning Africa as a rising digital frontier. This is crucial because future geopolitics will not only be about land and energy, but about data control and digital trade routes. Africa's growing tech ecosystems in cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Cairo, and Kigali are becoming part of global innovation flows. Infrastructure commitments are now including technology parks, smart grid systems, AI data processing hubs, and regional digital connectivity frameworks. These are not charity investments. They are strategic placements in future innovation zones. Of course, none of this is happening without controversy. Every major infrastructure surge raises questions about debt sustainability, sovereignty, environmental impact, and governance. Critics argue that some foreign funding models could recreate dependency cycles if not managed properly. Others point to land displacement risks, resource exploitation, and elite capture. These are real concerns. But what has changed compared to the past is that African governments and civil society are more aware, more vocal, and more involved in shaping terms. There is more transparency demand. There is more negotiation over local content, tax structures, revenue sharing, and labor conditions. The infrastructure wave is not free of risk, but it is happening in a more informed political environment than before. Another element making this moment powerful is multipolar competition. Africa is no longer engaging only with one dominant bloc. It is negotiating with multiple global powers: the US, China, the EU, Gulf states, India, and emerging Asian investors. This creates leverage. When multiple players compete to fund, build, and partner, Africa gains bargaining power, better financing terms, higher local content requirements, broader technology transfer, strategic autonomy. That dynamic is central to why these infrastructure commitments are bigger, more complex, and more strategically framed than previous cycles. What makes this shock real is that Africa is not asking the world to save it. It is positioning itself as necessary to global stability, energy transition, and economic resilience. That reframing changes everything. The world responds differently when it needs you. And that is exactly where Africa now stands. Not as a peripheral concern, but as a core component of the future global architecture. Looking ahead, the real question is not whether these pledges are impressive, but how they will be implemented. Infrastructure announcements tend to sound massive, but success depends on execution, governance, continuity, and local integration. The good news is that many African states are now building stronger institutional frameworks to manage long-term projects. Public-private partnerships are more structured. Regional development banks are playing more central roles. Cross-border coordination is improving through continental institutions and trade bodies. The gap between promise and reality is still there, but it is narrowing. For a continent that was excluded from the industrial revolutions of the past, this infrastructure pivot represents a possible entry point into the next one. Digital, green, logistic, industrial. If these projects align with education, industrial policy, and technology development, they could redefine Africa's position over the next 20 to 30 years. Not as a raw material supplier alone, but as an industrial, energy, and innovation partner in the global system. The world is used to reacting to Africa. This time, it is reacting because Africa moved first. By defining its infrastructure needs as global needs, by negotiating as blocks, by leveraging resources and demographics, and by refusing to play a passive role. This is why these infrastructure commitments are not just headlines. They are evidence of a deeper geopolitical recalibration, a moment where Africa shifts from being managed to managing its place in the world economy. And that is what truly shocked the world. Not the money, not the pledges, but the position, the posture, the strategy, the fact that Africa is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. It is building the table itself with its own roads, cables, power grids, trade corridors, and digital highways. And the rest of the world, whether comfortable with it or not, now has to sit at that table. You've been watching Africa Geo Trends, where Africa's moves shape the world. That if you haven't already, subscribe now and stay ahead of the next big story.